So I think the main thing hampering the Mosquito Coast in episode 3, everybody knows this is nowhere, is the lack of interpersonal conflict between the characters. There is a little bit of interpersonal conflict, particularly between Allie and Chewie at the beginning of the episode, but for the most part, people are just doing what they have to do, and there's not really any decisions to be made or indication that anyone is considering going against Allie too much. So what you have are the characters wandering through the desert north of the border and encountering various obstacles, but none of them are obstacles where they have to do anything other than overcome basically a physical obstacle. There isn't any question of, making choices, because there aren't many choices to be made. Most of these characters are they're stuck in a position where they have to keep going for various reasons. So to me, that made a lot of what happened this episode fairly uninteresting. Now, I think you can make very, very interesting stories that just take place on journeys through the desert, or even just in a static location in the desert, such as Flight of the Phoenix. But the stories that have succeeded in that regard, again, I think the emphasis was on the interpersonal conflicts, and what the characters were striving to overcome was not just a physical obstacle, it was also a mental obstacle, or the obstacle of learning to get along with the people that were along with them on the journey. And you really don't have a whole lot of that during this episode, which means you're just watching people wander through the desert, get harassed by a helicopter, run into a rattlesnake, hide from coyotes, and other, obstacles that are somewhat interesting. They're not completely without interest, but they're not as interesting as, it would be if these characters were actually were being brought to a boiling point by these obstacles. And so far, like I said, I think there's just not enough indication, one, that the characters are pushing back against Allie and his agenda for his family. His family seems so far to be content to just go along with him. You see, Chewie is really the only character this episode that has any pushback for Allie, and even he, at some level, doesn't really have a whole lot of agency. At some point, he decides he's going to help the family, and he just stops pushing back against what Allie wants to see happen. But Chewie, again, he's like probably the most interesting character in this episode, because he's the only one who isn't committed to following Allie wherever Allie takes him. And from that regard, he would be a more interesting character, and the conflict between him and Allie would be more interesting, except Chewie really seems, and this is not the actor's fault, by the way. The actor, Scotty Tovar, does an excellent job, and I would be interested to see more of this character in the show if they could find an organic role for him, because I think he's very charismatic, and he does a good job of showing empathy and of playing off the other characters. But the problem is, after that initial scene where he is angry at the loss of this person that died in the shootout right before they crossed over, after that scene where he's pushing back against Allie and saying, you're a jerk and I really, really hate you, basically, he doesn't really push back a whole lot after that, even when Allie is like telling him what he's going to do. And, it's like, what is Allie going to do if Chewie decides not to go along with it? It's not like they can get where they're going on their own. He really needs Chewie, so Chewie should be the one in charge, but they don't even allow that organic conflict to go very far. Most of the episode, Chewie is just there to ask questions about, why are you following Allie, to Margot, and to ask, what did your father do, to Dina. So it's like he really doesn't exist as a separate character. If he did, he would spend more time, dwelling on the death that happened, or the fact that he's killed 2 or 3 men. I really don't understand the logistics of that shootout. No way that he would have come out alive, given that the other men had automatic weapons and were already firing. If he had had the drop on them, maybe, but in that situation, given that he was a sitting duck in the car, there's just no way that he would have survived, except that he had protection from the script. But moving on, he literally grabs a snake, a poisonous snake, to protect Charlie. That's how little agency he has. He is here protecting the Fox family and guiding them on their way when he really has no reason to and not much motivation to. And from that perspective, it just undercuts his character in any conflicts he might have with Allie. I feel like they could have done so much more with Chewie than they did, and that's a frustration to me. Otherwise, this episode, it's funny because they're crossing this desert and they basically run into, I feel like, the maximum number of things that you could suspend disbelief for them to run into on their journey. For them to run into first this helicopter that chases them into this area that the Army has been using for practice targeting. You know, that was, okay, sure, I guess that could happen, although it's a big desert, like Allie says when he points out that, yeah, it's a bombing zone, but, you know, they're bombing only a small part of like 6 million miles. We'll be okay. All right, if 6 million, you know, if it's such a big area, then how is it that this helicopter finds them almost, you know, immediately as they're going through? That, you know, you have to suspend disbelief a little bit. And the fact that it seemingly didn't actually see them, or I don't know why it wouldn't have come down and got them if it was looking for them, which I assume it was looking for them. All of this was a little bit hard for me to suspend disbelief with. But then, you know, that they run into coyotes going the other way, and then a rattlesnake, and, you know, all the obstacles that you could possibly run into in a desert journey, I feel, to some extent. To me, you know, it's like, it's a lot to swallow. I'll swallow it because I understand that they have to keep things somewhat interesting, but at the same time, it feels like a lot. And I also, like I said, the frustration for me is what are these obstacles bringing out of the characters? Like, they get chased into that place, but it doesn't really teach us anything new about Allie and his relationship with his family. To a large extent, they seem happy to go along with him. So far, you know, Margot really hasn't shown much agency or much ability to say no to her husband, and neither have the kids, which is a problem. I'm not saying that I just want them to be fighting constantly. I realize that they have to escalate to that, and I think that as the season goes on, these conflicts will probably become more pronounced and possibly more interesting in the offing. But at the moment, the characters are too content to just be along for the ride with Allie, who, to a large extent, this episode, we don't really get to hear him giving his signature speeches about what's wrong with America and what's wrong with Americans. Instead, we just get to see him basically being a desert MacGyver, where he, you know, figures out all these solutions to problems. He figures out how to jury-rig this device so that they can make a cell phone call and get someone to come help them. He figures out how to create a stretcher to carry Chewie after Chewie gets bit by the snake. And, you know, he's basically, like I said, a desert MacGyver. He finds solutions to problems, but we're not really getting to see what's wrong with him. We don't really get to see his manipulations and other issues, because they can't really go back this episode. They're being chased, so they kind of have to keep going, and this creates a problem because they have to keep going. There's not really a whole lot of agency for any of these characters at the moment. Now, this could get better in subsequent episodes. I think that once they actually get into Mexico and start interacting with these people that have come to get them, I think that could become more interesting. But it's interesting to me because it struck me, I watched the behind-the-scenes documentary on this episode, and you're listening to Neil Cross basically explain basic screenwriting concepts as if he invented them, and you're listening to the actors talk about, you know, how great it is that they're shooting on location and not on a sound stage, as if no movie or TV show has ever been shot on location before. And it's a little funny because I'm like, your stylists were clearly omnipresent because your hair was never really very far out of place, Melissa George. And you were clearly getting constant hydration, so I don't know how hard the on-location shoots actually were for these pampered actors. But I have to say, though, watching this behind the scenes, you could call it a documentary. It's more of a puff piece on how awesome their show is. You see perhaps what might be going a little bit wrong here. I grew up in Mexico for 13 years of my life, and I feel like I've never seen a show made by Americans or made by non-natives that accurately depicted the country. I feel like they always tend to over exaggerate how dangerous it is in Mexico, such as Sicario. I've driven through the city of Juarez numerous times, and it's nowhere near as dangerous as that movie portrays it to be. But regardless of that, I feel watching this documentary, I got the sense that Neil Cross he's a good writer typically of Luther and other shows for BBC and other British networks, but I feel quite strongly that this was probably a show where they should have at least had a co-collaborator that was someone that had grown up in Mexico and really understood the culture, because I grew up there for 13 years and I wouldn't feel comfortable writing about it as a non-native. I also am massively confused as to how is this show called the Mosquito Coast, because Mexico is not the Mosquito Coast. That's a region in Africa. So I'm a little bit like, they wanted the title from Paul Theroux's book, but they didn't want to actually adapt the book. I don't know. In fairness to Melissa George and the other actors talking up the on-location shooting, the location shooting and the cinematography are excellent, and they're easily the one thing that keeps me engaged. I think the acting across the board is good, and I think that there's potential for the story to take off once they get to Mexico, but so far I just haven't been feeling this one. But those are just my thoughts for what they are worth. I realize a lot of you are probably really enjoying this show, and if you are, I'd love to know what you think I'm getting wrong about it. If you're interested in seeing my reviews of other upcoming shows, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching.